Everyone, welcome to the latest edition of DF Direct Q&A show, and we pushed this one back a little bit so we could talk more about DLSS 5. Joining me on this one, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich. Good as always to see you, and happy to talk about DLSS 5.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, Alex Battaglia.
Hey, everyone. After the blowout yesterday, only appropriate I'm here.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to kick off, first of all, by holding my hand up and saying that, yeah, we understand a lot of the feedback to the video. And I don't think we did a good enough job on the day. We had a lot to say, not a lot of time to say it. And we went straight from seeing the demos into making the video. And yeah, beyond that, hindsight is a wonderful thing, right? But we should have taken more time with the material. And I think it would have been prudent to wait to see the reaction from the audience and the developers to the keynote. And audience and developers, both super important to what we do. Opinion is clearly divided on this one, but looking over social media, it's been interesting to see varying opinions from both sides of the argument, audience and developers alike. Even so, lessons learned. But I guess, going back to the video we produced, why get excited about DLSS 5? Well, we spent 3 hours with 4 games and the Zora tech demo. We spoke in detail with the people that created DLSS 5. And whenever you're seeing something new and cutting edge, there's an excitement you get coming out fresh from those sort of types of encounters. And yeah, we can talk strengths and weaknesses about the technology in a bit, but ultimately, this is our first real look at games that are being driven by neural rendering, right? And there's a hell of a lot going on here that's going to be defining the elements of next generation graphics. But I think we needed extra time to talk with our teammates and come to a consensus about what we're dealing with here, good and bad, before we put something on the record, and we didn't do that. Equally on the record, though, as emotive a subject as AI is, you're really not going to make your point effectively by actively threatening or sending death threats to the DF team. This is crossing the line and totally unacceptable. So yeah, we put the video out, and as I mentioned, the idea was to follow up with a longer discussion, but the way things have sort of played out, we wanted to include supporter questions. So let's kick off with this one from Magnum Stash. Interesting video on DLSS 5. On first look, it appears too good to be true, and I suspect this is why the reaction has been mixed. Coincidentally, the sales of pitchforks have increased by 3,000% on Amazon. Ironically, it seems that NVIDIA has an image problem. The image output by DLSS 5 is so drastically different that people suspect foul play, as if NVIDIA has injected Snapchat filters into games against the will of developers. Do you think NVIDIA will have to show their working to assuage these concerns, to highlight how they're apparently using existing assets and not quote-unquote AI face filters that trample on the artistic vision? Intrigued to hear more about it before I head to B&Q, presumably for that pitchfork. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly take this one. Artistic integrity is something we touched on in the video, and we'll talk about that rather a bit more shortly. But for the record, during the demo we had, it was clear that all of the demos had been signed off by the studios of the people who made the game. So at that point, it assuaged some of the issues we had about the facial stuff in particular, along with the fact that it was clearly flagged as still being work in progress. How it was phrased was it's sort of like we're looking at a snapshot of current development. Things are going to change. We're also told about the controls developers have to work with in getting the look right. But yeah, ultimately, Capcom, EA, Bethesda, and others signed off on everything you saw because they own the IPs, right? So how do you weigh that against trampling on artistic vision? DLSS 5 integrations can't exist without the studio's support. And obviously, some studios might not want to be involved, but clearly there are quite a few that are involved. This question from Abandoned Walnut. Regarding DLSS 5, do you have any information regarding how much game developers can maintain artistic integrity whilst using the tech? There's been quite a negative response to the video, with concerns raised around it being quote-unquote AI slop, and a worry this might make graphics very quote-unquote samey and stifle artistic intent. I remain on the fence re this technology, but I wonder what your thoughts are on these sorts of comments. And we've got this question here from Fully Fallible. When DLSS 5 resolves detail not even found in the character model view of Resident Evil 9, at what point do we consider this technology damaging to the intent? If these details were quote unquote desired, wouldn't they at least be present there? So, Alex, in the wake of our video, before it went live, you actually put together some notes and impressions and whatnot. And this concept of artistic integrity, I'm not so much sure it's about the whether the studios sign off as such, although that's clearly important because, that's key to it, right? But at the same time, it's like the change is so dramatic in some cases. The original assets would never have been intended for that kind of presentation. Yeah.
And that was my largest technical issue with the demo. Before even talking about artist integrity and vision, which I think is the key impetus behind this specific part of this video, like the technical issue that I have with DLSS 5 is that essentially, since it is working on a 2D plane, yes, it is using color and motion vectors, that it has limited information about like the original model detail there. It's not being fed individual higher resolution versions of the like model that are offline rendered. It doesn't have the facial scans of the exact actor necessarily built into it, and trying to approach that asymptotic curve, trying to get there with that. Rather, it appears, based upon the kind of way it's fudging with some of the faces at times, it appears to be using a different data set, maybe a much larger data set, hence why it has the requirement of 2x 5090s to run in real time due to VRAM constraints. And this data set regarding things like human skin, eyes, whatever, I get the feeling it's doing some sort of averaging there over them, while also affecting the shading and the lighting on their faces particularly. And in this case, I think for a character like Grace, in the initial shot of her in the game's opening in the city streets that they show off, my initial gut reaction and then permanent reaction thereafter is this is not even the same person. And I think that is the key result most people get out of that. And then the second thing I get out of it is that I played the game quite a lot in preparation for a lot of my videos covering it. And I know that Grace, in that shot there, she is reluctantly going to the house where her mother was murdered. And she is not wanting to go there. She's nervous, all these things. She's not even caring about anything other than just like getting there. And she quite obviously doesn't look like she's wearing things like makeup and whatnot. And I honestly looked at the side-by-sides here and I thought I saw evidence of, other than the facial features being completely different, I see things like evidence of mascara. I see evidence of like what appears to be like pursed, lipsticked lips. And, like they even have like the, like one thing you do with lipstick is you like put it up here to make this like kind of devil's horns, like things that her original model did not have at all. Not even regarding the fact that the face was completely different, but it's kind of like when I look at a lot of AI generated features in other media, you see this kind of over averaging and over perfecting things based upon like, presumably the training data was based upon like, certain stock images of certain types of people. And so I kind of got that out of that, where the unique character model of Grace was completely gone. Ethically, I find that very problematic because the actress probably signed off on her likeness to a certain degree. And I don't find that very good to do to someone's acting performance, just like I find, and just like in terms of taste, George Lucas messing with the prequels pisses me off. Messing with the originals, pisses me off. So like, there's things like that where I say like, on a technical level, I think the inconsistency with faces and what it's doing to faces in certain scenes is actually the sign of a technical failing. And then on the other level, I kind of feel like there's great ethical problems with going over it even if the studio signed off on it. It's not, we've talked about it a lot on DF Direct before, but just because producers and, game owners and publishers sign off on something doesn't mean the entire team was on board, specifically the artist team who maybe created these character models or these environments. So I feel like I do actually feel like this does in some ways trample on vision very, very, in a very hardcore way that we haven't ever seen before from anything from DLSS, mainly because they were machine learning techniques about helping aspects of the maths. And here it's more like doing the entire scene over again in a lot of ways, which is so new and so radically different.
Oliver, what do you make of this?
Well, with regards to Grace in particular, I think that's a legitimate problem. And the fact that they led with Grace, I thought it was fairly provocative in terms of the introduction at GTC from Jensen Huang, and also in terms of the presentation to us. They led with that Grace face, and my immediate thought was that looks a little bit different than what I remember from Grace, even in the path traced version of Resident Evil 9. There are some NPCs that do look quite a bit better, and maybe you have less familiarity with how they look normally, like, random NPCs on a bench in Starfield or couch-bound NPCs in Hogwarts Legacy. But the kind of yassified Grace face, not so promising there. And it seems to reveal a weakness of this approach, or maybe the facial likeness is lost in certain situations, certain lighting. Again, it does not have very many inputs from the game engine, does not have very many inputs from the game, so perhaps it really is just inferring these details from a fairly limited slice of data there. It's the same problem that I think we saw with RTX Neural Faces a few years back, where you can improve the face's depiction in some ways, but almost lose fidelity to itself. And I noticed that with Grace. With other faces in this demo, I think the results are more mixed. Like some of the characters in Starfield, at least in some shots, looked pretty similar. Like that Sarah character looked reasonably similar, although absurdly realistic and high fidelity relative to her old portrayal, and kind of arguably a little bit AI-like. Other characters did not look so similar to their prior depictions, or there were other kinds of changes in lighting that betrayed deeper kinds of differences and potentially issues with that as well. But I mean, ultimately, I think that this is a first generation model. It does seem to produce fairly similar results across a range of games. That's a problem, but I'd hope that, again, if artists are signing off on this, if there are sufficient controls. I mean, it does not sound like there are a whole lot of controls, to be honest, in this first generation model. There's, intensity, color grading, and masking. So, you could, for instance, I presume that Capcom will be doing something along these lines. You could mask out Grace and say, hey, no DLSS 5 on Grace, or minimum DLSS 5 on Grace, or whatever tuning seems appropriate. But in terms of actually changing the stylistic aim from like photorealism to a different kind of aim, that does not appear to be something that you could necessarily do with this model. So yeah, I think artistic intent, it's a big wide open question. Obviously, if studio heads are signing off on it, that implies some level of consent, and that implies some level of, authoritative approval over this, but also it does not necessarily respect the artists who might be involved, or in this case, I don't think it's a full facial capture of the actress. I think they're using a separate person for the facial capture and a separate person for the actual performance. So a little bit more of a muted question there, but in general, I think these are very legitimate problems, and I think DLSS 5, when it works well, it works very well in some areas. When it comes to environmental lighting, it works perhaps less well when it comes to these character portrayals, which look very different, and in some cases uncannily different from their original source material.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. I think if they'd been leading with environmental stuff, then it would have been a completely different story in terms of the reception. But leading with the facial stuff, where the human eye is really trained to sort of detect consistency and authenticity, when you've got this filter running, when you've got this algorithm running, it's causing some issues there. I think it is relatively successful, though, in the Starfield ones, mostly down to the fact that the original shading was mostly flat. And I do think there is some improvement there. And obviously Todd Howard's all in on that particular one. Hogwarts not entirely sure about that one, but the actual demo itself is pretty good. And I think that's something that we couldn't really talk about or show really in the demo. The stuff that we kind of wanted to show was all off screen, which presented issues off its own, because some of the environmental stuff that's going on there is really, really quite special. I think the other thing which I think is quite interesting about this is that I'm seeing this as like a neural network representing NVIDIA's vision for photorealistic graphics, maybe 1 or 2 generations down the line, right? And the problem is that applies only to the lighting. So everything else within the scene is basically of this generation that's kind of like being shoehorned into that model. So it's kind of like almost like a clash of 2 different eras of technology, a representation of an era to come, possibly, and what we've got today. Kind of reminded almost of Metal Gear Solid Delta in that regard, where, you know, it plays like a PS2 game, but it looks like a PS5 game. There's a kind of weird disconnect to it. We've got this question here from, what could I say, exclamation point. What are your thoughts on the ethics morality of DLSS 5? This leads into a sort of wider question, because we've had a lot of developer feedback. I mean, there's been a lot of developer feedback online, developer feedback coming back to us. And it's kind of like, is this the right time to be talking about this sort of stuff when the industry is in turmoil, when there's a lot of jobs being lost, that kind of thing? What I will say is that the nature of DLSS 5 is that it cannot be a replacement for what game developers are creating. It can only work with what they're creating, and the higher the quality of the stuff that goes into DLSS 5, NVIDIA reckon the higher the quality of the output side. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that based on Starfield, but that's what they're saying. It's a harsh time in the industry, Alex, and to actually have, you know, the biggest AI company in the world producing demonstrations which are taking their work and presumably using it as a selling point for RTX GPUs, it's going to cause problems with the people making the actual games, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, just imagine, like, I didn't have any particular love of the NPCs in Starfield, and I'm pretty sure I've said that elsewhere in other, you know, like social media and whatnot. But say you take that and, you know, you see someone running this model over it, I think what you kind of feel is like, oh, it wasn't good enough back then. What's the point of my job? You know, will a producer at some point say, produce, you know, less? Let's use this generic model here and allow a targeted DLSS 5 like program improve it. We need less character modelers. We need less quality work. We'll farm it off to a production house in Southeast Asia and just run DLSS 5 over it. I mean, we live in an economy where the lowest rent sometimes is the bottom dollar, to use all these phrases together. Like, you know, like they will seek the lowest rent possible, certain people, and DLSS 5 could be an extreme enabling factor for that. I don't think, though, at least in the immediate future, on a technical level, it is completely like as dangerous, just because the demo was limited to very high-end hardware and had huge negative viewer backlash from my standpoint, and also still showcase large technical deficits that were off-putting enough that it was this controversial. I think if it wasn't off-putting, like other things we've seen in the past, maybe people wouldn't care as much, but it was off-putting to so many people that I think that there may actually be a bit of NVIDIA going to the drawing board here, or developers reconsidering this, kind of like we've seen in the past with regards to things like the unlaunching of the original 4080, I believe it was, or, the semi-unlaunching of the Xbox One's original intended message, because I do think this was so highly, this is my perspective, is just like, I only saw brute negativity across the board And I think that is also going to be one of the slowdowns to adoption here.
Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I would worry maybe at some point about developers over relying on these techniques, but you also have to think just about. I mean, it's very hard, within our current economic system to really think think these things through in an abstract way. But obviously, attention that isn't spent on lighting could be spent on other areas of game development and could be spent on simulation. And like there are different kinds of tasks, different kinds of areas that would be maybe exposed by a model that just has a very keen understanding, a very fine understanding of what makes photorealistic lighting. You could do all kinds of other things within game development that would be very important as well. So I think it's important not to discount that. Obviously, there would be an effect elsewhere, though, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Obviously, you have to be very sympathetic to that. But I mean, in the current form, at least, you get the best results according to NVIDIA. And I think we actually did see some evidence of this, that you get the best results with really high quality assets, with ray tracing, with path tracing, throw all those things in the mix. We saw all kinds of errors in Starfield where it's like the model is trying to infer like almost neural screen space reflections in the mix because it's so dependent on screen space, so dependent on what's in the view. As soon as that object falls out of screen space, you're losing the reflection. That's not a problem in a game like Assassin's Creed Shadows, for instance, which has a better representation of those kinds of lighting phenomena. So I think there is still definitely a case to say, hey, you want to produce the highest quality version of the game that you can produce, and then maybe this model will take it to the next level. In terms of actually relying on that, I find it hard to see developers relying on it too much. In particular, because like Alex pointed out, it's very high-end hardware. It's also only NVIDIA hardware. It's also only PC. And it's also not out yet. So it's like there's so many levels of this where it's like you could never ship a game that relied on this fully. There would be so many different, and I mean, this creates all kinds of quagmires for artists and all kinds of quagmires for people who are trying to ship a consistent look in a game across platforms. Obviously, we know how important that is. That's why games like Doom the Dark Ages ship ray tracing across all their platforms, all their supported platforms, because I think it's so important to have a consistent visual look, a consistent lighting look across platforms. And reconciling that with this is a lot harder, I'd have to say. So yeah, I do think that those are real issues that need to be worked through and are legitimate.
I think from my perspective, it's not DLSS 5 that's the problem for all of the reasons that you've pointed out, Oliver. It's basically the fear of what it represents, the stuff that is to come.
Right.
But at the same time, because let's face facts. We know what the specs of the next generation consoles are. We know what's happening with RDNA 5. We know what's happening with Blackwell and presumably RTX 60 series when that comes along. It's all about the bump in shaders will be fewer. The increases will come from ray tracing technology and machine learning. I mean, literally everybody is on the record now as pointing that out. Mark Cerny, for example. So, the concept of having a neural network-based renderer, or at least partly part of the game engine, I don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But it's still going to need human inputs. I don't think it's going to be a kind of one-size-fits-all solution to getting a great-looking game. And I guess there's similar things as well. If you're looking at the amount of technology that's packed into Unreal Engine 5 that's basically given away for free, all manner of different tools can either be enabling or they can lead to job losses because, a lot of the heavy lifting is being done for you. So, yeah, this is just the beginning, really. Let's move on to this question from Frametime Sommelier. Hi, DF crew, exclamation point. A bit confused about DLSS 5. What was NVIDIA's reason to show it now? It's a fair point. I mean, we've not even got 4.5 dynamic frame gen yet. Why not showing it when it is ready and about to be launched, like with all the other DLSS tech in the past? The tech is very interesting, but I notice that the reception from average gamers is not that great. The discourse is mostly about the fact it runs on two 5090s and people call it a fancy Instagram filter. Just quickly there, they've spent 3 years working on this, and they're in the optimization phase. If it comes to the point where you're going to not be able to run it without the use of two GPUs, I don't think it would ship. I don't think it would ship at all. And they've already said they're going to be producing a version that runs on one GPU. I think this was just like a performance thing, to be honest. We did ask about scalability with DLSS 5, and they said it's basically exactly the same as other DLSS. It scales with resolution. So the lower the resolution goes, the easier it gets. Yeah. I'm not, I think I don't know why they showed it now, to be honest. It's kind of weird to do it at GTC, which hasn't typically been a consumer facing event. So I was surprised when we found out about that.
I think it is a really big and flashy item to lead GTC with, as Jensen did. And also he wanted to flag this is like the future of graphics rendering, and he wanted to tie it in this big flashy new graphics announcement with what they're doing with like structured databases and semantic context and all these other things that exist in an enterprise context that are not so sexy, but when you tie them up with like something that looks like a crazy game render from the future, all of a sudden you are showing off something that's sexy. I also think that it might need, it just needs more developer integration than prior versions of DLSS. It needs more artist time. It needs more work, and it's at more risk of leaking, because if you're disseminating this amongst a bunch of different studios, a lot of people are going to have their hands on this, I'd have to assume. And yeah, that's also going to be the case. And I also just tend to think that, NVIDIA, they really put it out front and center. They didn't, like, it is an optional option here, but they didn't present it that way. Like if it was just presented as, oh, here's something that's like RTX neural lighting or something. Here's an option, or here's a little tweak. Because people don't get that upset about RTX Remix or HDR mods or reshade plugins that can dramatically change game appearances. But in this case, it's presented not just as something that NVIDIA thinks is important to the future of graphics, but as DLSS 5, which almost just, it's not quite optional, even though it is optional on paper. In practice, the way that it's presented suggests, it suggests something else entirely. So yeah, that's just my feeling on that. I think that's kind of the way that NVIDIA presented this was maybe not the way you'd present this if you were trying to create less of a splash.
It's definitely provocative to call it DLSS at all, bearing in mind what DLSS has previously stood for, which is basically super sampling in one dimension or another. I'm not sure what the super sampling is here, but it is an evolution of machine learning technology. But Alex, the power of the brand, I mean, DLSS is basically now such a fundamentally attractive feature to so many people. Do you think that it actually is a very provocative move to call it DLSS?
I mean, on some level, so there's a lot to say here. So DLSS in the past has meant many things. I would say it has originally meant that like super resolution feature, and it kind of was that with DLSS 1 in a way. And then DLSS 2 was a different way to do a similar problem, like the same problem, change it the way you solve it. But then FrameGen came out and it was named 3. And at the time, we were also a bit like, why is this even called DLSS? The brand was so powerful at that point in time that you could attach optional features to it. And because that's what they are, they don't usually turn on all at once, and they really shouldn't. So I think that was a learning lesson there for NVIDIA that, yes, the DLSS brand is an encompassing suite of optional technologies people can take advantage of in their games. Some used maybe more than others, and some loved more than others. But then attaching this to it, which is, I would also argue, fundamentally different on a lot of ways than even frame generation or super resolution is, does have a bit of brand tainting, because DLSS was, for the longest period of time, not clowned on and really actually liked a lot. And probably was one of the main reasons why people would buy an RTX GPU. I can imagine, like, DLSS looks that good. And here, that the first impression for a lot of people isn't this, I can't believe it's running at 540p. I think a lot of people is like, they're like, that's not Grace. I'm also a little bit interested why this is the direction that DLSS goes in so quickly. Because I maybe because it'll evolve better over time. There'll be more iteration time for it. Is when it's out in the open and they find the issues and all the problems with it. But also, I actually originally thought that DLSS would evolve in a very different way that we'll probably talk about a little bit later in the video. But here, man, beyond the ethical quandaries and the visual issues and the fact that I don't like generative AI at all. Yeah, this is, I do feel like it is a super strong and not the best way to use the DLSS brand in a lot of ways.
Okay, fair enough. Obviously, it's a research and development thing that was going to happen anyway, because, we can cite the interview with Tom Peterson that we did in Berlin, Alex, where he was talking about this, along with Fame Generation before Fame Generation came out. And then we can cite the interview that you guys did at CES last year, I believe, with Brian Catanzaro, where he was basically hinting very heavily about this. So the direction of travel is that this is actually going to happen one way or another from whoever wants to do it. I guess my sort of point here is, could it have been introduced under something a bit more experimental as opposed to a major milestone in a what's effectively becoming a standard technology?
Probably. I'd agree with that.
Okay, so let's quickly talk about some of the technical reactions that we've got here, because we didn't talk about everything in the short amount of time that we had in the video that we did before. And Alex, you've been putting some notes together as well. Oliver, I'm going to come to you first here, because I don't know, it's really interesting that you're seeing people, respected commentators and analysts like Ryan Shrout, who had the same demo that we had, reacting in a similarly positive way that we did. Mm-hmm. And then you're sort of seeing the assets online, as Alex would say, being clowned on. The assets weren't fully representative of what's going on there. And I think the concept of this neural network providing a drive to quote unquote photorealism kind of makes sense in the flesh, but it doesn't in the stuff that we've had to show.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that this is a really complicated thing, but like walking out of the demos, I was super impressed by just the temporal consistency. And this is something that does not come across in the footage that we have, either the very brief snippets of footage that NVIDIA provided or the off-screen footage that we have that is necessarily degraded by being captured through like a CMOS sensor and having compressed color range and having lower fidelity, right? At least the content that we sampled, and we had full control over these games, the game content was remarkably stable for what is basically like, a very, very fancy video-to-video model. It did exhibit screen space artifacts of the kinds that we discussed in Starfield, right? Where it's trying to infer reflections that are not physically grounded necessarily in anything but the on-screen imagery. But the temporal consistency was super, super impressive. And it's especially surprising because the model seems to use so few inputs. Like, I actually dredged up just recently. I said something on DF Direct back 2 years ago where I basically said that I thought the direction of travel in game rendering might go towards something where you're combining a game engine with some kind of AI generation model, generative AI model, which could take graphical input, could be material IDs, could be motion vectors, could be a lot of different inputs, and then produce something kind of in that Catanzaro vibe, although I would never compare myself to him, obviously, in any respect. But, I said basically if this becomes extremely optimized and very good, then perhaps that'd be a very potent combination. But I never really thought that you could get there with just color and motion vectors. I mean, to go so far in color and motion vectors, it's just incredible. And obviously, it does produce a very transformative result. I mean, we can talk about some of the nitty-gritty details when it comes to environmental lighting, when it comes down to faces. There are some very impressive things going on here. I think the overwhelming sentiment that was taken away from these demos was just that the faces don't look correct. I do agree the faces don't look correct.
Right.
I think the faces have that AI-generated look that Alex noted. I think they often lack fidelity to the source. I also think the tone mapping is just incorrect. Like when you look at these scenes, the tone mapping is dramatically heightened relative to the original versions. Someone actually put together a quote-unquote corrected tone mapping version of a lot of these images, and all of a sudden, a lot of this contrast, a lot of this AI-generated look seeps out of the image and they appear much, much more natural. And I wonder if they had led with that imagery, if the response would have been markedly different, because when you do see them in that context, you can start to appreciate some of the improvements that are present in the imagery. So yeah, I think a lot of this just comes down to the fact, and perhaps maybe it comes down also to the fact that people who are making the decisions around how to present this content might not have been artists, They might have been programmers. They might have been technical people. They might have been modelers. Might have been, I mean, modelers in the AI sense, not in the, creating model sense. They might have been people who, are biased towards things that humans like and are biased towards punchy imagery. And that's a perfectly fine bias to have. And certainly a lot of people like that imagery, but it also does not necessarily compare well to the original work. When you're trying to say this is an improvement, when you're trying to highlight some improved lighting in a picture, but all we can see is the dramatically heightened contrast, dramatically heightened kind of thresholded look of characters and their skin and their eyes and all these different things. So yeah, I mean, this is such a broad topic, but I do feel there are a few threads in there worth exploring. But overall, I just feel like NVIDIA's presentation of what is fundamentally a very impressive piece of technology, not just in terms of temporal consistency, but also in terms of making radical changes to an image and having that be stable over time, and some of those changes being very favorable. I just feel like this is a bit of a problem of their own making potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting looking at your notes and reactions, Alex, that a lot of the environmental stuff, you just kind of put it down to exposure adjustments.
I mean, that was the gut reaction day of. Yeah, for sure. To me, it did remind me of, and at the time I really described it as photo-like, and I couldn't come up with a phrase of it, but maybe this phrase that I should have used is studio photo-like, where you see people with, like large flash amplifiers when they take photos, and then if you've ever seen that style of photography, you know exactly what I'm talking about, or HDR combined photography. So like that's kind of what I got out of it from that aspect. To talk about some of this from a technical perspective, though, there is actually quite a lot to say. And I think this is what I wanted to reference earlier, but I didn't want to talk too much about technical considerations. But I wonder if this is the wrong hammer for a screw. And mm-hmm. and I the reason why I say that is because I do think about color and motion vectors and a 2D image and things that we tried to get away from for a long period of time with stuff like ray tracing and path tracing is screen space artifacts, screen space view-dependent issues. And now when screen space stuff doesn't affect the entire image and takes place in very small portions of an image, let's say screen space shadows that are very conservative, mm-hmm. then you don't notice the issues with them so much, so where people are like really happy with them and they love them. But as soon as screen space, things that are only really there in screen space start to take up larger parts of the screen, I think that's when everyone starts getting to, I hate this effect. I hate SSAO. I hate SSR on big bodies of water. This person's skin looks weird because it uses screen space subsurface scattering. It doesn't make sense from this lighting angle. They look clammy or they look papery. And so when you rely too much on screen space, you can start having visual issues in a game. And I think since this is applying to the full image and it's applying to things which are very, very 3D, constantly moving character models, for example, disoccluding geometry all over the place. I didn't see it in motion. I imagined it is temporally stable, but I also think that you're just going to get big issues in terms of consistency. And I saw that in the demo when characters were different sizes on screen. I talked about it in my initial gut reaction. Grace, when she's blown up in a cutscene really close to the camera, the ABs or the swipes are very similar to one another beyond micro things it is doing to her skin pores and maybe some differences in the eyes. But then you get to stuff like Grace being smaller on screen, and I think that's when the model with less resolution, since she's smaller, further away, less detailed, less accurate lighting due to denoising and everything, then it has a lot of trouble bringing out anything that is reasonable, and you get these hallucinations that make Grace not look like Grace anymore. And so I think that is a fundamental issue, and it actually is a very different way than I thought neural rendering would be going. When I saw papers talking about like neural representation of surfaces, materials, geometry, anything like that, I thought we would be seeing like discrete primitives being adjusted by neural stuff, but still rendered via path tracing. So we'd get the benefit in that aspect, and that's where we'd spend the ML hardware in. But this here is using that ML hardware for post-processing the image after the fact, which may at some point in time in the future actually be a good way to add the final touch with less bias. But I think right now it is too much of a heavy hammer given the visual quality. I'm not even talking about ethics. I'm just talking about the technical stuff there. And so that is the kind of like appreciation I got of it from the technical things. But that doesn't mean everything was visually awful. I won't go into that and say everything was AI slop. I thought there was a lot of AI sloppy looking people there. But I thought also, like when it did the close up of Leon, I immediately noticed that his hair had way better shading on it. Like path tracing hair, that is hair strands, totally ridiculously expensive. And so we do simplifications on lighting, shadowing, everything there. And the hair with DLSS 5 there was superior by far. You could also see that when a lot of the character models from Starfield, they would have hair that was not attached to their heads, essentially, in terms of lighting. And the hair shading was very simplified. Man, on most of them, the hair just looked actually a lot better with the way it sat on the head, disregarding stylistic differences with their faces. So like there is an application for this, I presume. We adjust things in path tracing with screen space information all the time to make them better. We add in things like fog. We add in things like decals. Anything that is volumetric is pretty hard to trace against. And I could imagine this post-processing style of using ML to get better details into the thing actually is super applicable. But I think this is such a huge, large screen problem applying to whole image with only 2D information, and it just falls into problems visually, not even talking about the ethics. So yeah, that was kind of my take on the technical side of this demo.
I think another thing that's going to happen, we kind of alluded to it in the first video, is that the process by which you can create DLSS 5 imagery is such that even if developers don't support it, it's going to be modded in anyway. So there is an argument that the genie is kind of going to come out of the. I mean, if it is like a 2D color space and motion vectors, which are part of NVIDIA Streamline anyway, the mods are going to come, right? Surely.
Yeah.
And so the genie is sort of out of the bottle in that respect.
Yeah.
And and I think there's something else to it, which is that the thing that I kind of find most that I've been reflecting on most is basically that there is only one model here, and that model is NVIDIA's. And it may well be the case that it's kind of like a binary response to it from a developer's perspective. Yeah. It's either like, yes, this suits my game, or no, it doesn't, when I think that the future of the technology is going to be a lot more nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of comments very similar to Alex's from different developers I've been talking to, different people I've been talking to. I completely understand that perspective, but I also think from NVIDIA's perspective, there's probably an enormous temptation here to say, hey, we basically want something that can be a big post-process, something that understands, quote unquote, understands lighting, understands at least the characteristics of photographs, can apply them to game imagery, and can produce what appears to be a radical improvement, or at least in some cases, a radical improvement in lighting fidelity on older games, right? On games that have already shipped, on games like Starfield that don't even have ray tracing. On, you could go back, they talked about using this in Minecraft. You could do this to really old games and do like RTX style lighting remasters. You could do all kinds of different things. Like this opens up so many different doors for you that a technology like a neural materials could not necessarily. And I presume neural materials, I think that's still part of NVIDIA's plan for this, but like this technology is more totalizing on game output and really in just a much more dramatic way. So if you can get this to stick in some capacity, and it looks like they've made it stick at least to some degree and solved some of the really hard problems like temporal consistency, which I always thought was just going to be a dead end for this kind of technique for years and years, but evidently is not, at least with this kind of more modern, more conservative approach to just relighting scenes as opposed to changing like geometry in a major way or swapping out styles, artistic styles in a huge way. It seems like you're able to do this. And, like you do see big improvements in lighting across different scenes. Like in this shot, for instance, in Starfield, the characters are horribly underexposed for lighting conditions. They're basically silhouettes. The shadows aren't really there. And when you go over to the DLSS 5 view, the shadows are deeper and imply real depth and dimensionality. Light transport is much better. You get much better material definition. Like there are a lot of improvements there. Also get the added SSR reflections in Starfield, which I keep going back to just because I think it's charming that we've basically gone, we're back to SSR, and that's like the pinnacle of graphics rendering at the moment is redoing SSR, but in an incredibly computationally expensive way that requires a second 5090 at present. That's kind of amusing to me. But they also add in contact shadows in this scene in Hogwarts Legacy in a very cool way. They add rim lighting, which is kind of an artistic flourish in some ways, but it's kind of cool. In Hogwarts Legacy, again, that's something that, no reshade plugin could really do to this level of degree, I would say. You get obviously that complete shift in lighting conditions in Oblivion. We don't need to talk about that too much, but obviously other parts of the image are adjusted. The shadows are adjusted to accommodate that kind of more overcast look. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of changes in here that are really interesting technically. Like Alex noted, there are all kinds of problems that this kind of solves with one fell swoop. And I think the other thing about it that's kind of interesting, maybe getting back to my earlier point, is like, you don't need individual systems to fix lighting problems, to fix material problems in your games. If this is working imagine a perfect version of this, you would not need those systems, right? Or even a good working version of this, you would not need those systems, or at least those systems would be dramatically de-emphasized. So it's like, here's one model in the same way that like GPT is a model that is like generally intelligent. You can feed any content into it and it can understand it. It has semantic awareness. It can do all these different things with some limits, of course. This model is like solving lighting to such a fantastic degree that you could really get an incredible result out of it. Now, are we seeing that today with this model? I would say no. But version 2, version 3 of this technology, especially if we get all the important artist controls that are necessary for this to work, maybe you have some kind of like prompting system where you're combining the semantic awareness with more direction from the developers and things like this. Like you can imagine a version of this that does something quite extraordinary. And I think that would be an immense accomplishment. I don't think we're seeing it today with this model, but I think that's the temptation, at least from NVIDIA's side, where they're trying to push out something that is provocative and perhaps without the integration from developers and the understanding from developers that perhaps they should have before they pursued this project in public in the way they have.
Okay. I think we should wrap up now. There's still a huge debate going on. It's not going to be stopping for quite some time. I wonder when there will be a consensus. And I wonder how how long away that is. I don't know.
Well, also not having a consensus is fine as long as there's multiple paths to achieve similar goals, hence artistic vision, hence doing things by yourself, right? And I think that's one of the things that is very different about this is that it is, kind of like a lot of the democratizing features of technology is that you don't have to have any good sense of artistic value to apply to certain techniques to something. And we saw this all throughout rendering technologies past. The first time we got programmable full screen, shading, people would just throw quads on the screen and, shade games with piss filters. Like we had years of the piss and the brown filters. So like the thing is like, I think this, like a lot of things, it's going to somehow come out and, it's just a matter of leaving room for any sort of artistic vision is probably the key thing there for me, and just letting people not use it, of course.
For now, I think there is going to be a lot of choice involved because like there is so little support, and it's only probably going to run on high-end NVIDIA 50 series GPUs, I'd have to imagine. And it is going to be completely optional in these games. So for now, at least, it is basically something along the lines of a reshade plugin or RTX remix or HDR mods. I mean, a lot of game developers set HDR in ways that people really dislike, but arguably that's the developer's vision. Maybe they wanted their HDR peak white to be set at 400 nits. Who knows? I mean, some developers genuinely do want that appearance, but I set it to 2000 regardless. And maybe that's stripping away some, I mean, that's certainly disrespecting the artistic vision. Don't get me wrong, disrespecting the artistic vision. This is something that's maybe along the same lines at its most offensive, I suppose. Although you do have buy-in from the developers, but suppose you were just enabling it on a per game basis without that kind of consent there, using something like Optiscaler. But yeah, I mean, this is just so complex. I think the real question is, like, how does this shake out? Does it shake out that in 6 months this comes out and everyone with like a 5070 Ti, 5080 or above is just toggling on all games, Optiscaler, everyone just loves the look and we're going forward with it? That's a very different future from the world in which this comes out. People all of a sudden observe all kinds of issues in games that weren't evident in Rich and I's, understandably somewhat time-limited experience in a few demo areas and a few games that were shown to us, even though we did have significant control over those games. Maybe there are issues. Maybe the reality of getting the models down to work on less than 250/90 is just going to cause some issues for its graphical output again. And we won't ever talk about this ever again. Or maybe it'll be somewhere in between. I suspect it'll be somewhere in between. But yeah, this is going to be a hard thing to shake out in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to wrap up here with a final question from Garten Racer. Hey there, I hope you're feeling well, because being at the centre of a shitstorm is never great. Was this your first one? Man, are you a newcomer? I don't think so. I mean, you can go back all the way back to the original Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 head-to-heads we did back in the day. It was like a shitstorm every week, basically. So it certainly wasn't the first one. I guess last year there was the whole Zelda ad thing as well. Alex, you've certainly stirred up a hornet's nest in the past by saying that FSR1 wasn't very good.
Yeah, the FSR1 was probably the first time I freaked out. I think that was also a core learning for me, where I realized there's only so much control you have over a video you produce with 1.5 work hours a week in it. And the fluidity of YouTube doesn't mean that the audience is forgetful, but if you come back a week later with something that isn't controversial or something everybody loves, you're not branded for eternity for being the guy who didn't like FSR1. So, I think that'll be, I hope, a lot of people's reaction to this, where they say, like, they looked at the first video, they feel like it was incomplete, and then they come back to this and they see more nuanced opinions that couldn't fit into 15 minutes with more people, and they realize, hey, actually, DF's great dudes.
Well, I think that ultimately the bottom line is that you can't say something and that becomes your position forever. There is actually sort of scope to change your position based on new information, and certainly the amount of information we had from the death threats up to constructive comments, and certainly some of the in-depth stuff that we had from developers, some of which were aware of the technology but hadn't actually seen it in action, some of which were like blown away by it, by the way, and but at the same time very concerned about it because of the lack of control on it, for example. I mean, the bottom line is that, I guess that's my sort of, the sort of thing that I keep thinking about here is that it is going to be the fact that URL rendering will become a standard of some description. It won't just be one vendor defining what it is, though, with one model. There's going to be lots of them out there. And I think at that point, when there is that proliferation of that technology, the very nature of success means that you are going to need to have control over what it's actually doing, right? That's something where, that's still a bit up in the air, I think, with certainly with DLSS 5 at the moment. But yeah, certainly much to be thinking about over the coming days. But I guess I'm not quite sure when we'll see more of DLSS 5, or actually the extent to which NVIDIA might pivot or not pivot. I suspect not pivot, or if they do pivot, it will be in ways that are possibly more advantageous to developers. I'm sure there'll be a lot of more feedback coming in now. The drapes have been pulled off on it. And then I guess the question is really when we get up to the launch time in fall 2026, the extent to which it's actually usable. That's still a big question mark at the moment. I mean, they have got it running on one GPU, by the way, but it's clearly not in a performance state at the moment. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using the second 5090. I don't think that second 5090 is being like fully used to do. Actually, well, I don't know about that.
It was kind of loud
because they could have just. It was definitely two 5090s in there, but surely it's not running a whole 5090s worth of ML power to do it. How would you optimize that down? That would be kind of crazy. Anyway, still much to ponder on this one. I think, Oliver, thinking back to when we finished the demos, and it was like the first reaction was there's a lot to process here. And maybe that is the point where we should have given a bit more thought to pausing and coming up with something a bit more thoughtful later on. It's just that we saw some really cool stuff. That's the bottom line. Okay, so that was our Q&A show. We'll be back very, very shortly with the next edition of DF Direct Weekly and a Q&A show after that. But for now, thanks for watching Digital Foundry, and we'll see you soon.